Streets of Rage 3 had a lot to live up to when it released in 1994 on the Sega Mega Drive and Genesis, as it would be the third installment in the very popular beat-em-up series, which would also include many different changes from the first two games, even adding in a more complex story and plot, with the inclusion of character dialogue in between levels, aiming to create more in-depth scenarios. But also the gameplay would be improved, being much faster, with more integrated abilities from all of the characters, and even upgrades, depending on whether you can keep alive long enough without losing any of your overall lives. If you've ever played the second game, Streets of Rage 2, you'll know that it is quite simply seen as the greatest beat 'em up of all time, and for a lot of good reasons. Excellent graphics, great gameplay, and one of the best soundtracks undoubtedly within any video game ever seen. And Streets of Rage 3 does follow in those footsteps, more or less. Yes, it has faster gameplay abilities. It too has some of the best visuals ever seen in a game on the Mega Drive. In many ways you could even consider it to be a little bit more detailed compared to the games that came before it, and the game was highly reviewed across the board, many considering the improvements, taking note of what was there. But at the same time, you couldn't help but notice, while the game did have some additional characters that you could play as and some unlockables that you could use or gain access through cheats, something was missing. While the gameplay was just as fluent as that of Streets of Rage 2, the ambience and the atmosphere just wasn't the same, even though it had way more features than the previous two games, even to a point that on some levels, especially later in the game, there was hidden rooms and areas that you could access to if you knew where they were. You could change into them and they would take you in different directions, and depending on the difficulties, the game would give you access to different story endings depending on your choices or the difficulty that you choose. Even in some cases, the faster you play through the game, you will also unlock more features. I think for me, going back, when Streets of Rage 3 was announced and when it did come out, it did take a while before we got access to try and play it. And yes, it is a very enjoyable game, don't get me wrong. It's an excellent game actually, very underrated in many ways. But because Streets of Rage 2 was so dominant and is still dominant today, 3 really didn't have a look in. While it did improve, like I said, on so many different areas, it just missed a few key components that made Streets of Rage 2 and even the first game so memorable. And I think really where that lies in was the soundtrack. But yes, in saying that, the developers and even the music artists, along with Yuzo Koshiro that done the soundtracks for the original games, did do a good job with the third entry, don't get me wrong, but they wanted to take a different direction in terms of the overall feel, and it does take a bit of getting used to, I will admit, but it just doesn't have the same appeal or impact that the second game particularly has. Even if we were to compare all three titles, even the first game's soundtrack is far superior to the third game. It's more memorable, more iconic, and it just stands out a mile, and you instantly recognise it as soon as you hear it. The same with the second game, but with the third game the soundtrack isn't as memorable. Now that'll differ depending on when people played the game, because for many people back in the day, the third entry might have been the first game they would have played in the series, so that might have been the most impactful game for them. Everybody will have different memories or experiences or even opinions of the game, but even with the game's story, while it does take place sometime after the events of the first two games, Mr. X is up to his tricks yet again, but this time he is taking a different approach, to a point that he is now using bombs to destroy buildings around the city, but he's also taking advantage of being able to control and manipulate robots, even to a point that he's mimicking behaviours and even likenesses of some of the game's characters, which you will face later in the game, to try and frame well-known figures within the city in order to take it over. And this is where the game will take you through a dynamic kind of like story, where certain actions or choices, or even how you play, can affect different outcomes or even down to the difficulty. If anything, it kind of feels almost futuristic in a way, because a lot of the robot characters you will face but will later end up being bosses, with one of them being Axel, almost like a carbon copy of him, and then even with Mr. X at some point in the game, and you will meet more later on. And while it does try to go more in depth with the story, for me personally it still just didn't hit that mark that the second game did. I don't know, it's just, there's something about it that just missed on something specific. But aside from all of those gripes, is it a bad game? No, it's not. If anything, it's a really good game, and and if we class it in terms of the overall category of the beat 'em up genre, it's still one of the best of its kind out there, and it does surpass its predecessors in so many ways, but there's just certain elements that just leave it lacking. And I suppose because of the reception of the game, it also led to the demise of the series for quite some time. While there was attempts to try and revitalise the series over the last 20 or so, nearly 30 years, but it wouldn't be until the last couple of years as of recording this video when Streets of Rage 4 would eventually surface. That would take place well into the future, years after the original games, and that in its own right, for its time when it released in 2020, was one of the best and one of the most popular games that released in that year. And it's easy to see why, because there has been lots of attempts to revitalise the beat 'em up genre, and while there are some good games out there and they do copy and try to reflect and take a lot of inspiration from the original Streets of Rage games, they just don't have that same level of impact. But Streets of Rage 4 manages to capture that appeal of the original games even more, so that it's closer to even to the original two games. Great graphics, a very good soundtrack, great level of detail, and even lots of throwbacks to the original games, even being able to play as the original digitised characters, even with some of the levels hidden depending on certain things that you do, which is very, very cool indeed. A must play in my book, and one of the best beat 'em ups, if not the best beat 'em up that we've seen in the modern era, still to this day. But even aside from that, when you look at all the beat 'em ups, for me the king of them all, and I think everyone will agree, is Streets of Rage 2. However, and I will say this, if you're a fan of the series, you do actually need to play the third game, because it is very, very good. Aside from what people think, or the gripes, or the disconnection from certain elements when you think of the music, or even just the atmosphere around it, it is definitely a must try. While the game feels familiar, it also feels different at the same time, which is interesting. But whether you think it's any good, well, that's for you to decide.